He spat the words, each one a shard of ice slicing through the frigid night air. Go on, be independent out here, Maria. His beer-heavy breath fogged around his sneering face as he shoved me from his rusty truck onto the deserted, frozen roadside. The red tail lights vanished into the blackness, leaving me with nothing but my thin housecoat against the kind of cold that steals your breath and freezes your soul. I knew, even as the first uncontrollable shivers racked my body, that this beer-bellied monster wouldn't be the end of my story. Oh no. His karma was on its way, and I had a chilling premonition it would arrive not in a sputtering pickup, but in a sleek, silent, mysterious black car. That thought, a tiny, furious ember in the encroaching ice, was all I had to cling to. My name is Maria. Just 2 years before that night, I was a young woman whose world was painted in the warm, vibrant colors of the Philippines. My village was small, nestled amongst lush green hills, where the air always smelled of my mother's cooking. Adobo simmering, rice steaming, and the sweet perfume of sampaguita flowers drifting on the evening breeze. Life wasn't easy. We farmed a small plot of land and I sold handmade crafts at the market, my earnings a small contribution to our family. My biggest dream was to give my younger siblings the education I never fully received, to lift my parents from their worries. The laughter of my family, the close-knit embrace of our community during fiestas, the feeling of the tropical sun on my skin. That was my normal, a life rich in love, if not in material things. But I yearned for more, for a chance to provide, to see the world beyond our village. That yearning led me, with a heart full of hope and a touch of nervous excitement, to an international dating website. I wasn't just looking for a husband, I was searching for a partner, a future, a promise of something better for all of us. Mark found me there. His profile showed a man with a seemingly gentle smile, a little older, an American who spoke of quiet evenings, a comfortable home, and how much he admired Filipina women for their devotion. His messages were filled with poetry I later realized he'd copied from the internet, and promises of a life where I'd be cherished. He painted a picture so beautiful, so alluring that my desperate heart, so eager to believe, overlooked the faint, discordant notes. He paid for my visa, my plane ticket. My family, tears in their eyes but pride in their voices, threw a small despedida, a farewell party. They prayed for my happiness, for my success in this new land with this new man. I remember the heavy, humid air of Manila as I boarded the plane, my pulse a frantic bird trapped in my chest. It was the biggest step of my life into a future I couldn't truly imagine. When I landed, Mark was there. He was larger than his photos, his smile a little dimmer in person, but he had a small bouquet of slightly wilted carnations. And for a fleeting moment, standing there in the bewildering noise and chill of an American airport, I allowed myself to believe the dream was within reach. The initial weeks in America were a dizzying blur of newness. The supermarkets were vast palaces of endless choice, the cars on the wide highways moved with terrifying speed, and the houses in Mark's suburban neighborhood were all so similar, set back from quiet streets lined with trees whose names I didn't know. Mark's house itself was a surprise. Not the cozy, well-kept home he'd described, but a rather drab, slightly neglected bungalow that smelled faintly of stale beer and dust. It was functional, I told myself, trying to stay positive. In those first days he made an effort. He showed me around the small town, bought me new clothes. American clothes he insisted I wear, and pointed out landmarks with a possessive air. But the kind, attentive man from the emails began to recede, like a tide going out, leaving behind someone else entirely. The Mark I was now living with was often sullen, his patience thin, his beer belly, which I'd politely ignored in his photos, seemed to be his most prominent feature, growing more pronounced with each passing day. The first time his words truly stung, the first time a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach, was about a month after my arrival. I'd spent all afternoon carefully preparing a traditional Filipino dish, sinigang, a sour and savory soup my mother had taught me. I wanted to share a piece of my home, my culture with him, hoping it might bridge the growing distance I felt. He sat at the table, his eyes glued to the blaring television, took one spoonful and made a face of utter disgust. "What is this garbage, Maria?" he grumbled, pushing the bowl away with such force that soup sloshed onto the worn placemat. Can't you learn to cook something a man actually wants to eat? Like a steak? Or a burger? American food. His voice wasn't just dismissive. It was filled with a contempt that made my cheeks burn. I tried to explain, my English still faltering, that it was a beloved dish from my country, but he just waved his hand, his attention already back on the flickering screen. Soon after, he began to openly mock my accent, exaggerating my pronunciation of certain words and then letting out a short, barking laugh that made me feel foolish and small. He told me not to bother trying to talk to the neighbors, claiming they were nosy and wouldn't understand me anyway. "You have me," he'd say, his eyes glinting. "You don't need anyone else." The walls of the house, which had initially seemed like a new beginning, started to feel like they were closing in. An invisible blanket of isolation began to settle over me, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't the dream. This was something else, something cold and unsettling. The unease didn't lessen. It became a permanent fixture in my life, like the constant drone of the television Mark always had on too loud. His passive aggression was a daily torment. If his can of beer wasn't chilled to the precise temperature he preferred, or if I hadn't managed to scrub every trace of his slovenliness from the bathroom by the time he returned from his sporadic, low-paying job, a job he complained about incessantly, he wouldn't shout, not always. Instead, a heavy sigh would escape his lips, a theatrical display of disappointment that hung in the air, making me feel like a constant failure. He'd promised a joint bank account, a partnership. That never happened. He controlled every penny. Each week he'd hand me a small, carefully counted wad of bills, barely enough for groceries from the discount store, certainly not enough for anything personal, and definitely not enough to send even a few dollars back to my family in the Philippines. That had been such a core part of my hope to help them. When I once gently broached the subject, his face hardened. "You're my wife now, Maria," he stated, his voice flat and cold. "Your responsibilities are here. With me. They can figure out their own problems." His campaign to isolate me was relentless and insidious. If I was on a precious timed call with my mother or sister trying to sound cheerful, he would linger nearby, his presence a suffocating weight, making me censor every word, unable to share the truth of my growing misery. He'd complain loudly about the cost of the calls, even as I saw him spend far more on six-packs and scratch-off lottery tickets that always ended up crumpled in frustration on the floor. He refused to teach me to drive, saying it was too complicated for me, too dangerous, and besides, where would I even go? He discouraged me from looking for any kind of work, even part-time cleaning, claiming my English was too poor and that a good wife stayed home. His definition of a good wife, I quickly learned, was a silent, obedient servant who anticipated his needs, kept the house immaculate, and never ever questioned him. The bright, hopeful young woman who had stepped off that plane full of dreams was being systematically erased, replaced by a timid shadow, constantly walking on eggshells, terrified of triggering his displeasure. Small cruelties became routine. He'd accidentally spill his beer on the floor right after I'd cleaned it, watching with a faint smirk as I hurried to wipe it up. He'd change the television channel in the middle of the one program I found comforting. Each act was a tiny pinprick designed to deflate my spirit. I started to suspect he derived a twisted pleasure from my dependence, my unhappiness. The dream of a loving partnership had dissolved into the grim reality of a gilded cage, and I felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The night everything shattered began like so many others, with the stale smell of beer and Mark's simmering resentment. A brutal early winter had descended, and the wind outside shrieked like a banshee, rattling the loose window panes. The argument this time was over a small folded brochure I'd picked up at the library, the one place I sometimes found a few hours of peace. It was for an evening English language class at the local community center. I'd hidden it carefully in my small drawer, but he'd been rummaging, probably looking for any spare change I might have tucked away. "What's this then?" he'd roared, his face flushed a mottled red, brandishing the brochure like evidence of a terrible crime. "Trying to get fancy ideas, are you? Think you're too good for me for this life?" His voice, already loud, escalated with each word, fueled by the cheap whiskey I could smell on his breath. I tried to respond calmly, my voice trembling slightly. "I just want to improve my English, Mark. To understand things better." Maybe find a small job later. To help. But he wasn't listening. His eyes, usually dull, were now blazing with a terrifying, uncontrolled fury. He launched into a tirade about my ingratitude, how I was supposed to be a simple, traditional wife, not some educated woman with opinions. He called me names, ugly, demeaning names that clawed at the last fragile shreds of my self-worth. Something inside me, perhaps the last spark of defiance, made me stand my ground. I have a right to learn, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I have a right to want more. That's when he lost it completely. He lunged forward, his hand clamping around my arm like a vice, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. You have no rights except the ones I give you, he bellowed, his face inches from mine. He started dragging me, despite my protests, my pleas, towards the front door. I was only wearing my thin cotton housecoat and flimsy slippers, having been preparing for bed. The moment he flung the door open, an arctic blast of air hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. You want to be so independent, Maria, he spat out, his voice thick with malice. Then be independent out here. He shoved me roughly out onto the small, icy porch, then down the concrete steps. I stumbled, pain shooting up my leg as my knee scraped against the frozen ground. He followed, grabbed my arm again, and hauled me towards his old, beat-up pickup truck, its engine already rumbling ominously in the driveway. He practically threw me into the passenger seat. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the icy patches, and we sped off into the howling darkness. He drove erratically, a continuous stream of venomous abuse pouring from him. Then, after what felt like an eternity of fear and freezing air blasting through the poorly sealed window, he swerved abruptly to the side of a dark, deserted country road, miles from any light, any house, any sign of civilization. He killed the engine, reached over and flung my door open. Get out, he commanded, his voice now chillingly devoid of emotion. No. Tears were streaming down my face, freezing on my cheeks. Mark, please, I begged, my teeth chattering so violently I could barely form the words. So cold. I'll die out here. I really will. He just let out that horrible, barking laugh, a sound I will never forget. Should have thought of that before you started acting all high and mighty. He slammed my door, got back in, and with a final, contemptuous look, drove away, leaving me utterly alone in the vast, freezing, terrifying night. The wind cut through my thin housecoat as if it were made of paper. My body began to shake, not just from terror, but from a cold so profound it felt like it was seeping into my very marrow. This was his solution. This was his ultimate act of control. But as the numbness began to creep into my fingers and toes, a different sensation sparked within me, a cold, hard, unyielding rage. He would not be the end of me. I have no idea how long I stumbled along that dark, frozen road, my body racked with shivers, my mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. Each gust of wind was a fresh assault, pushing me closer to collapse. Headlights would appear in the distance, a fleeting pinprick of hope, only to roar past, oblivious to the desperate, freezing figure on the shoulder. My voice was too weak, my pleas swallowed by the relentless howl of the wind. Just when I felt my legs begin to buckle, when the encroaching blackness felt almost like a welcome relief from the pain, a pair of headlights slowed, then cautiously pulled over beside me. An older couple, their faces illuminated by the dashboard light, peered out, their expressions a mixture of shock and concern. They must have seen the raw desperation etched on my face, the way I was huddled against a barren fence post, trying to find some non-existent shelter. They didn't ask many questions. They just gently helped me into their warm car, wrapped a thick blanket from their backseat around my trembling shoulders, and drove me to the nearest small town. They took me to a brightly lit, all-night diner, bought me a hot cup of tea that scalded my numb lips but sent a welcome warmth through my system, and they called the police. The officers who arrived were kind, their voices gentle as they listened to my fragmented story. They took me to a women's shelter, a plain but blessedly warm building. Stepping inside was like emerging from a frozen hell into a haven of safety and compassion. The volunteers gave me dry clothes, a hot meal, and a clean, quiet room with a soft bed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited within me. I knew with absolute certainty that I could never, ever go back to Mark. His cruelty that night hadn't just been a moment of anger. It had been a deliberate attempt to break me, to dispose of me. He had severed every last thread. In the calm, supportive environment of the shelter, I began the slow process of healing. The volunteers were angels. They connected me with a legal aid society, and that's how I met Sarah. She was a lawyer, sharp and no-nonsense, but with kind eyes that told me she understood. She listened patiently as I recounted my story, from the hopeful emails to the frozen roadside. She explained my rights, the options available. Divorce was a certainty. A restraining order absolutely essential. But then, as we began to sift through the few documents I'd managed to bring with me, visa papers, a couple of old bank statements Mark had carelessly left out before he'd locked down all access to finances, Sarah's brow furrowed in concentration. She tapped a well-manicured nail on one of Mark's old pay stubs, one I'd found stuffed in a coat pocket. "Maria," she said, her voice thoughtful, "this income he declared here. It seems awfully low for someone maintaining a house, even with his habits. And these credit card statements and these loan application confirmations addressed to you. Did you sign for these? Did you even know about them?" I stared at the papers she spread out on the desk. There were credit cards in my name I'd never seen, applications for small personal loans I knew nothing about. My signature was scrawled at the bottom of each, but it wasn't my handwriting. It was a clumsy, almost childish forgery of my name. A cold wave washed over me. Mark hadn't just been cruel and controlling. He had been systematically using my identity. Sarah, with a determined glint in her eye, began to dig deeper, bringing in a forensic accountant she occasionally worked with. What they started to unearth was far more calculated and insidious than just domestic abuse. My beer-bellied husband, the lazy, contemptuous man who had treated me like property, was also a petty con artist. He'd been using my good name, my clean credit history as a new immigrant, to apply for cards and loans, accumulating debt, and almost certainly underreporting his own meager earnings to dodge taxes. He'd targeted me, a woman from a foreign country with limited English and little understanding of the American financial system, thinking I'd be an easy, silent victim. The mysterious black car I'd envisioned in my frozen despair started to solidify in my mind. It wasn't some romantic notion of vengeance. It was the entirely predictable arrival of federal agents and tax investigators. Sarah laid it out clearly. We had more than grounds for a divorce. We had evidence of serious financial crimes. My testimony, coupled with the paper trail they were meticulously assembling, would be devastating for him. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer just Mark's discarded wife. I was the key witness to his unraveling. A grim, icy satisfaction began to bloom in my chest. He thought he could freeze my spirit, erase my existence. He had no idea I was about to turn up the heat and watch his whole sordid world burn to the ground. The strategy was clear, and Sarah executed it with precision. She filed for divorce immediately, citing extreme cruelty, abandonment, and irreconcilable differences. Simultaneously, she compiled an airtight dossier detailing Mark's fraudulent activities, the forged signatures, the unauthorized credit applications, the discrepancies in his tax filings, and submitted it to the Internal Revenue Service and the state's Financial Crimes Investigative Unit. I spent hours with Sarah and then with investigators, providing detailed statements, recounting every instance of his financial secrecy, every suspicious transaction I could remember, every lie he'd told about money. The wheels of justice, as they say, can turn slowly, but with strong evidence and persistent advocates, they grind with undeniable force. The weeks that followed were a period of quiet rebuilding for me. The shelter helped me find a small, subsidized apartment, a tiny, clean space that was all mine. I enrolled in the English class I'd dreamed of, my confidence growing with each new word I learned. I even found a part-time job at a local Filipino bakery, run by a wonderfully kind woman named Mrs. Santos, who listened to my story with sympathy and gave me a chance. I was slowly, painstakingly, laying the foundation for a new life, a life free of Mark. Then one crisp autumn morning my phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the underlying note of triumph. "It's happening today, Maria," she said. "They're moving on him this morning." I didn't need to be there to see it. Sarah recounted the details later, and my imagination filled in the rest with a profound sense of vindication. I pictured Mark, probably still in his grimy, threadbare bathrobe, nursing his first beer of the day, the television blaring some mindless morning show, his oversized belly spilling over the waistband of his pajama bottoms. The knock on his door wouldn't have been timid. It would have been firm, official, the kind of knock that signals trouble. He would have shuffled to the door, irritated at the interruption, expecting perhaps a package or a complaining neighbor. Instead, he would have found himself face to face with several stern, unsmiling individuals in dark, conservative suits, official badges glinting on their lapels. That, I knew, was the arrival of his karma. Not one mysterious black car, but likely several unmarked government vehicles parked unceremoniously along his quiet suburban curb. His initial surprise would have quickly morphed into blustering indignation, then, as they presented him with official warrants, into a rising tide of panic. I could see them, methodical and implacable, beginning their search of his messy, neglected house, the house where he had made me feel so small and worthless. They would be uncovering more evidence of his shoddy, pathetic little schemes, hidden bank statements, lists of falsified information, perhaps even undeclared cash. His neighbors, the very ones he had warned me against as busybodies, would undoubtedly be peeking from behind their curtains, witnessing his grand downfall, their quiet street suddenly alive with official activity. The man who had wielded his perceived superiority over me like a weapon, who had treated me with such utter contempt, was now being publicly exposed as nothing more than a common cheat, a low-level fraudster. The authorities, Sarah told me, were meticulously thorough. They found everything. His pathetic attempts to blame me, to paint me as the conniving foreigner who had tricked him, crumbled under the weight of the evidence I had already provided, the clear proof of his forgeries, and my full cooperation with their investigation. My signature on those documents was demonstrably false. The best, most liberating part of it all? Because he had committed identity theft, the substantial debts he had fraudulently accrued in my name were systematically disputed by Sarah and ultimately wiped clean. I was free of him, and I was free of the financial chains he had tried to bind me with. His arrest for multiple counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion was swift and decisive. The man who had callously abandoned me to freeze on a desolate road was now facing the cold, unyielding reality of a jail cell. The satisfaction I felt wasn't a fiery, vengeful rage. It was a deep, quiet, and immensely gratifying sense of cosmic justice meticulously served. He had sown the wind with his cruelty and deceit, and now he was reaping the inevitable, devastating whirlwind. My revenge hadn't been loud or overtly confrontational. It had been precise, legal, and utterly ruinous for him. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of legal activity, but thankfully most of it swirled around Mark, not me. He hired a cheap lawyer and tried to fight the charges, clinging to his ridiculous lies, but the mountain of evidence against him was insurmountable. His beer-fueled bluster completely deflated in the stark reality of the courtroom. He was found guilty on all major counts. The judge, clearly unimpressed by his attempts to portray himself as a victim, handed down a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his calculated deceptions: several years in federal prison, coupled with substantial fines and restitution orders. His grimy little house, the one where he had played king in his own squalid castle, was seized by the government to help pay off a fraction of his debts. His life, the one he had built on lies and exploitation, was effectively over. For me, however, it was a true beginning. The divorce was finalized swiftly and cleanly, a simple administrative process now that he was incarcerated. With the unwavering support of Sarah, the kind souls at the women's shelter, and my wonderful new boss and friends at the bakery, I began to build a life that was authentically mine. I threw myself into my English classes, my confidence blossoming. I enrolled in a community college program for bookkeeping and accounting, determined to understand every nuance of finance, to ensure I would never again be vulnerable to that kind of manipulation. And finally, with immense pride, I was able to regularly send money home to my family in the Philippines. Money I had earned honestly. My younger siblings were getting the school supplies and uniforms they needed, and I could hear the relief in my mother's voice during our calls. Looking back now, the naive, hopeful young woman who stepped off that plane into Mark's waiting clutches seems like a distant memory, someone I barely recognize. The experience with him was a dark, terrifying chapter, one that left scars, but also one that taught me profound lessons. He preyed on my dreams, my vulnerability as an immigrant, and my unfamiliarity with his world, thinking I was a disposable pawn in his pathetic games. But his calculated cruelty, his despicable attempt to break my spirit and abandon me to the elements, ultimately forged a resilience within me I never knew I possessed. I learned that true independence isn't just a word. It's built on self-respect, hard work, and the courage to stand up against injustice. I learned that while dreams are essential, they must be anchored in reality and pursued with open eyes, not naively entrusted to the hollow promises of manipulative strangers. Karma, I've come to understand, isn't just a vague concept. It's a very real force. Sometimes it operates subtly, and sometimes, as in Mark's case, it arrives with the undeniable authority of the law, heralded by the appearance of those sleek, dark official cars. I am no longer that shivering woman on the side of a frozen road, pleading for a warmth that would never come from him. I am warm now, wrapped in the life I have built for myself. I am safe. I am respected. And I am, at long last, truly, undeniably independent. And that, more than anything else, is the most satisfying revenge of all.